It was on a bright Halloween morning when my daughter-in-law accidentally turned me into a homeless old woman. She didn't just burn down my house, she burned down the love of a 67-year-old woman who had already given too much. After years of being drained, humiliated, and used, I finally made a decision that most mothers would never dare to make. Do you want to know what it was? Then stay with me until the very end of this video because my story is only beginning. And before we dive in, I'd love to know where my dear listeners are tuning in from. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, like, and share this video to support my journey. Now, come with me. The story starts here. Halloween night was supposed to be full of laughter and candy, not ashes and smoke. I had just filled a crystal bowl with orange-wrapped chocolates for the neighborhood kids when I caught a strange smell, burnt plastic, mixed with something sharp chemical. At first, I thought it came from the jack-o'-lantern by the porch, but the smell thickened fast, crawling through the floorboards. My hands froze over the candy bowl. Then came the faint crackling sound from below. Within minutes, the fire roared through the storage room. Flames swallowed the shelves where I kept old Wiggs photographs and the small safe with my insurance papers. I grabbed the extinguisher, but the heat pushed me back. The sound of glass breaking echoed from the basement window. Ruby kept shouting about calling 911, yet her phone stayed in her pocket. By the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. I stood barefoot on the cold street, watching my house melt into orange and black. The firefighters' voices were calm routine, as if this was just another night. When they finally approached me, one of them said the fire had started from an unattended candle. I nodded, unable to speak, but my mind replayed the sight of the basement floor earlier that day, a dark stain near the safe, smelling faintly of gasoline. Ruby cried loudly beside me, saying how sorry she was. Neighbors gathered whispering about tragedy and bad luck. I heard none of it. I only watched the flames reflect in her tearful eyes. Something in me knew those weren't the tears of a victim. They were the start of something calculated, something far from an accident. My hands were still shaking when the officer handed me the last form to sign. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, and the ink bled a little from my trembling grip. Behind me, the ruins of my house still hissed under the misty dawn. Ruby stood a few feet away, pretending to talk to the insurance company. Her tone was soft, sympathetic, carefully rehearsed. But when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught the curve of her lips, just the hint of a smile. A small, satisfied smile that froze my blood colder than the morning air. I finished signing and turned toward her. My voice came out cracked like the ash beneath our feet. I asked if I could stay at their apartment for a few weeks until things settled. She didn't hesitate. She just tilted her head, pity written on her face, but not in her eyes. She said their place only had 3 bedrooms and that she and Ethan needed space. She mentioned a guest room used for friends or work people sometimes. The message was clear. There was no place for me. I nodded, pretending to understand, though my heart sank. She offered to help me find a cheap motel nearby, said she'd check online later, but never took out her phone. I watched her fingers still manicured perfectly, not a trace of ash or guilt. The faint smell of her floral perfume mixed cruelly with the lingering smoke in my clothes. That night, Ethan called. His voice was full of confusion and sympathy. Yet I could hear the hesitation underneath. He said Ruby told him the apartment was too small and that I'd be more comfortable somewhere private, like a motel near downtown. He promised to send money for a few nights. I wanted to scream that I didn't need his money. I needed a roof, a family, a sense that I still belonged. But I couldn't say it. The distance between us had grown like the blackened walls of my old house. When the call ended, I sat in the fire station lobby, clutching the only thing I had left, my wedding ring. Outside, Ruby was already talking to someone in her car, laughing softly again. The sound cut through me like glass. In that moment, I understood something bitter and final. My house hadn't been the only thing she burned. She had started a slow fire beneath the bond between mother and son, and it was working. A week after the fire, I sat in the temporary office of the insurance company, my palms sweating as I waited for the agent to call my name. Everything still smelled faintly of smoke. The clothes I wore, the documents in my purse, even the hair I had washed 3 times. Across the room, Ruby chatted easily with the receptionist, introducing herself as a co-owner of the property. The word sliced through me. Co-owner. My house, the one I had bought with 30 years of savings, had never been shared with anyone. I remembered last spring when Ruby had begged me to transfer a small portion of ownership to her and Ethan. She said it would lower the property tax and help with the mortgage insurance. She'd smiled sweetly and waved some papers on her tablet, saying it was just a formality. I had refused. I told her that house was my retirement, my safety. She laughed it off, kissed my cheek, and said I worried too much. Now, sitting in that office, I realized how dangerous my trust had been. The insurance agent handed me a printed copy of the updated policy. I scanned the lines, and there it was, her name, Ruby Harrison, listed as co-owner. My signature appeared right below it. I felt dizzy. I had never signed any digital form, never even received an email about this update. When the meeting ended, one of the insurance investigators, a gray-haired man with a cautious tone, asked to speak with me privately. He closed the door and lowered his voice. He told me that my signature looked suspicious. The timestamp of the e-signature was from a late night in September, but the access log showed it came from a different device, one registered under Ruby's email. My throat went dry. He warned me that insurance fraud cases could get complicated and advised me to double-check all my accounts and legal records. I thanked him, though my voice trembled. As I walked out, I caught Ruby leaning against her car, smiling into her phone. Her laughter rang through the parking lot like a bell. That night, I sat in the small motel room staring at the copy of the policy under the yellow lamplight. The forged signature stared back at me like an accusation. For the first time since the fire, fear gave way to something colder, sharper: doubt. And under that doubt, a seed of resolve began to grow. The days after the fire felt endless. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the cheap floral wallpaper, trying to remember the smell of my old house, lavender candles, fresh coffee, the faint, powdery scent of the wigs I used to style. Now everything was gone. The wedding photo that once hung above the fireplace, the letter my husband wrote before he passed, the first handmade wigs I crafted back in 1989. They had all turned to smoke, erased, as if my whole life had never existed. When Lydia came to visit, she brought a small bag of muffins and a look of worry that she tried to hide. We had known each other since beauty school. She sat beside me, patted my hand, and said softly that I needed to be careful. She had heard stories about Ruby, how she spent money fast, how Ethan's credit card was always at its limit. I nodded, though I already knew the truth deep down. There had always been something hungry in Ruby's eyes, something that no amount of luxury could satisfy. That evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ruby. Just 2 lines. "Hope you're doing better. This month's utility bills came in. Could you help me cover them for now?" I stared at the screen, reading it again and again. My house had burned, my life had collapsed, and she was asking me for money. "No, Mom, are you okay? No offer of a place to stay. Just a bill." I didn't reply. I opened a new folder on my phone and saved the message. Then I started collecting everything: emails, receipts, voicemails from the insurance company, screenshots of every text. My fingers moved automatically, like muscle memory. I had done this before. Twice in my life I had watched everything crumble. Once, when my salon went bankrupt again, when a business partner forged my name. Each time I rebuilt myself from nothing. Each time I learned one rule: never ignore a pattern. By midnight, the motel room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I looked out the window at the dark parking lot, the flickering neon sign that read vacancy. My reflection in the glass looked older, harder. Grief had burned itself into resolve. Ruby might think I was weak, but she didn't know the woman I used to be, the one who survived lost debt betrayal, the one who knew how to start again. I stood on the empty street long after the firefighters left. The smell of wet ash clung to my coat, and the air still shimmered faintly with heat. My house, or what was left of it, stood like a black skeleton against the pale morning sky. Windows, shattered roof, half collapsed, memories turned to smoke. I whispered to myself, if this was truly an accident, then she wouldn't be afraid of an investigation. The words felt heavy, but they steadied me. Ruby had gone home hours ago, leaving behind only her crocodile tears and fake concern. I refused her offer of help to arrange temporary housing. Instead, I took the city bus and checked into a small roadside motel near Cleveland Heights. The sign flickered weakly, and the clerk didn't ask questions. I told everyone else that I was staying with relatives, not wanting word to reach Ruby too soon. The less she knew, the better my chances of finding the truth. That night, sitting on the stiff motel bed, I emptied my handbag. Most of it was useless. Half-burned keys, melted lipstick, the faint smell of smoke in every pocket. But at the very bottom, beneath a folded grocery receipt, I found it, an old silver USB drive. My heart skipped. Inside that drive was the draft of my will, written but never notarized. The document clearly stated all properties and savings belong solely to Nora Harrison. I held it in my hand for a long moment, the metal cold against my skin. The fire hadn't taken everything after all. This tiny piece of plastic and steel might be the only thing standing between me and the woman who wanted to erase me. Outside, the street was quiet. A few cars passed headlights brushing across the soot-streaked windows. I looked out and saw a faint glow in the distance, the smoke from my home still rising. My reflection in the glass looked tired, but sharper eyes no longer just grieving, but calculating. I opened a fresh page in my notebook and began to write list of names, contacts, lawyers, people I still trusted. Each stroke of my pen was slow and deliberate, a reminder that I was not finished. Not yet. I used to think the fire took everything. But no, it only burned away the illusion around me, revealing the hand that lit the match. And now, with the ashes still warm, I made myself a promise. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I was never a rich woman, but I had built a life brick by brick with my own two hands. After my husband left in 1986, it was just me and Miles. He was only 8 then, with big brown eyes that watched everything I did. I took every shift I could at the wig shop in Columbus, Ohio, a small storefront that smelled of hairspray and lavender lotion. Most of our clients were women battling cancer or hair loss. I used to tell them that beauty wasn't about what they'd lost, but what they chose to carry with dignity. Maybe that was how I kept myself going too. Money was always tight, but Miles never felt it. I packed his lunch every day, saved coupons, and kept a coffee can of coins under the sink for emergencies. At night when he was asleep, I stayed up sewing lace wig caps or trimming synthetic strands under the kitchen light. I told him over and over that money doesn't fall from the sky, but honor can vanish with one lie. He would nod solemnly, too young to understand what it really meant. Years passed and the business grew. I became manager, then part owner. By the time I turned 60, I had saved enough to buy a small 2-story house in Cleveland Heights, a quiet street lined with maple trees that turned gold every autumn. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My retirement fund and savings added up to over $200,000. For the first time, I felt safe. I thought I had outsmarted life itself. Miles grew into a fine man, gentle and polite. He became an engineer, proud and independent. When he called one day to tell me he had met someone, I felt pure joy. Her name was Ruby. She sounded warm, clever, ambitious. I wanted to believe she would bring happiness into my son's life. Looking back, I see how blind that faith was. From the moment Ruby walked into our family, things began to shift so subtly that I mistook manipulation for charm. She complimented everything I owned, then suggested ways to upgrade. She brought candles that smelled like luxury hotels and spoke about investments as if she knew the world better than I ever could. I thought she was just modern, confident, the kind of woman my son deserved. Now, sitting here surrounded by the ashes of everything I built, I realize how wrong I was. I spent 40 years saving for peace. I never imagined I'd need that money to defend myself from the very woman my son chose to love. The first time Miles brought Ruby home, she looked like every mother's dream for her son. She wore a soft white turtleneck, simple gold earrings, and a smile that seemed both shy and practiced. Her voice was gentle, each word carefully measured, and she kept holding Miles's hand, as if the gesture itself could prove devotion. I remember thinking she was delicate, maybe even fragile. Miles looked happy, radiantly so, and that was all I had ever wanted. Over dinner, Ruby spoke about her past. She said she grew up without a father and that her mother had been sick most of her life. Her tone trembled at the right moments, and when she looked down at her plate, I saw a single tear glisten on her lashes. My heart softened instantly. I told her she could stay a few days to rest, that she was safe here. I didn't know then that kindness can be a currency in the wrong hands. Those days stretched into weeks. Ruby moved around my house with an easy grace, helping in the kitchen, complimenting my cooking, offering to clean even when I refused. Yet every conversation drifted somehow toward money. She asked about the cost of property taxes in Cleveland Heights, how long I had owned the house, whether I planned to keep it in the family. When I mentioned my retirement savings, her eyes lit up for just a second before she smiled and said she admired my discipline. I told myself she was only curious. After all, she was part of the family now, or so I wanted to believe. When they married the following spring, the ceremony was small but beautiful. Ruby looked like an angel in lace, and I remember whispering to myself, maybe she truly loves him. But love, I would later learn, can wear many faces. A year into their marriage, the first cracks appeared. I discovered Ruby's name listed on Miles's joint bank account. At first, I tried to see it as normal. Many couples share finances, but small signs began to pile up. Miles stopped asking my advice about money. He stopped visiting as often. Whenever we talked, his words felt rehearsed, as though he was reading from a script written by someone else. I realized then that I wasn't just losing influence. I was being gently erased. Ruby's soft voice had turned into something sharper, though still wrapped in sugar. She didn't need to raise her tone to win. She only needed patience. And I had underestimated her patience completely. Ruby always knew how to sound reasonable. She had a way of wrapping manipulation in logic, of making greed sound like family planning. One Sunday afternoon, she and Miles came to visit with coffee and pastries, sitting across from me at the kitchen table that had seen every milestone of our lives. Ruby began softly, almost shyly, saying they wanted to settle down for the future kids. She said a small condo closer to my neighborhood would be perfect so we could stay near each other. Then she looked at me with those calm, deliberate eyes and said, "If you could help us with the down payment, maybe $150,000, we could make it happen sooner. You'd be part of it, of course. We'll list you as co-owner." Her tone was gentle but firm, her smile full of reassurance. Miles nodded beside her too, trusting, too eager to believe she was doing the right thing. Ruby worked as an accountant, so she spoke with authority, calculations, mortgage terms, tax benefits, all laid out neatly in her printed spreadsheets. She told me that with my help, the interest rate would drop, the paperwork would be easier, and we could all live close as one family. I wanted that closeness. I wanted to be part of my son's life, to hear laughter in the same hallway again. So I agreed. The papers were signed at the bank, a notary present, everything looked official. I remember the smell of the ink, the cold marble counter, the steady rhythm of the pen scratching the page. I felt safe in that moment, surrounded by what looked like legitimacy. I transferred $150,000, my lifetime of savings, meant to secure old age, and left the bank believing I had invested in a home and in family. Months later, when Ruby's tone turned colder and her warmth began to fade, I asked to see the property documents. She sent me a PDF labeled Contribution Agreement. It stated that I had contributed funds toward the purchase, but ownership belonged to primary buyers, Miles and Ruby Wallace. I stared at the words until they blurred. My name was nowhere on the deed. It wasn't until I spoke to a lawyer friend, an old client from my salon days, that the truth hit me. He explained calmly, in Ohio, unless your name appears on the deed or title, you have no legal ownership, even if you paid 90%. His voice was sympathetic, but firm. I remember sitting in silence after he left, the reality sinking in like slow poison. I hadn't invested in family. I had funded my own exclusion, and I had signed the papers myself. When the twins were born, I thought my life had finally come full circle. I imagined quiet afternoons in their nursery, reading stories, baking cookies, and being the kind of grandmother I never had the chance to be. But Ruby had other plans. She smiled sweetly, thanked me for the baby clothes I'd sewn by hand, and said I should rest, that I'd done enough in my life. "You're tired, Mom," she said softly. "Let me take care of the kids. You deserve a break." It sounded loving, but underneath it felt like a door closing. Weeks passed, then months. My visits became scheduled, approved, and limited. At first, I was allowed over every Sunday, then every other week. Eventually, it was when the kids aren't too busy. Ruby always had an excuse: the twins were napping, or had piano lessons, or weren't feeling well. Each time I smiled and said I understood. But every time I hung up the phone, the silence grew heavier. Even when I did visit, it never felt like my son's home anymore. Ruby managed every detail: the children's schedule, the meals, even the way Miles spoke. She'd interrupt him mid-sentence to finish his thoughts or clarify what he meant. Miles, once so warm, now avoided my eyes. He was polite, kind even, but distant, like someone half asleep inside his own life. I noticed how Ruby filtered everything. She controlled their social media, answered messages on his phone, and once even replied to my text, pretending to be him. I realized it when she used punctuation. Miles never did: perfect periods, capital letters, not a single typo. My son's messages had always been messy and full of warmth. Hers felt cold, precise, immaculate. One afternoon, while helping her print some documents, she had said the printer was acting up. I saw something that made my stomach turn. On her laptop, an open email thread with the subject line, "Future Planning." The latest message was to a friend: "The less she's involved, the cleaner things will be later when we divide assets." My name was never mentioned, but I didn't need it to be. I knew who she was. I walked out quietly, my hands shaking, pretending I hadn't seen anything. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times Ruby had smiled at me, poured me tea, called me Mom. Every act of kindness now felt like a thread in a web I had willingly stepped into. By the next morning, something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt just hurt, I felt awake. It started with little things, the kind you almost don't notice until they add up to something heavy. Miles's tone changed first. When I asked about a few missing bills that used to arrive under my name, he smiled politely, almost rehearsed, and said, "Mom, Ruby just wants to keep things organized. Don't worry about it." His words were calm, but they built a small wall between us brick by brick. Soon, Ruby began transferring all the household accounts' electricity, water insurance into their names. She said it was for convenience, that I wasn't good with online systems. I wanted to argue, but she said it with such gentle authority that I almost believed her. She printed everything out in color-coded folders, smiled, and said, "It's just paperwork, Mom. Nothing's really changing." But things were changing. Slowly, silently. One afternoon, while checking my bank statements, I saw a withdrawal, $50,000 gone from my savings account. My heart thudded hard enough to hurt. I called Miles immediately. He hesitated before answering, then said, "Oh, that. Ruby and I thought it was time to invest in some stocks. You'll see, it'll grow." His voice was confident, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath. My son had never been interested in the stock market. That wasn't his language. I asked if he'd done it himself. He stammered. Then Ruby's voice floated in from the background, cheerful and controlling, like honey hiding a sting. "Tell Mom not to worry. It's under control." That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of my small bedroom, the shadows shifting with every passing car. I told myself that Miles was a good man, that he must not know what she was doing. He'd always been gentle, easily persuaded, the kind of person who believed people meant well. I wanted to keep believing that. But inside me, something had begun to shift. Every sweet gesture from Ruby now looked different under the light of suspicion. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every "don't worry" Mom sounded like a curtain closing. So I started keeping notes. I wrote down dates, amounts, excuses, small fragments of a puzzle I didn't yet know how to solve. I saved screenshots, printed statements, and tucked them into a folder at the back of my closet. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Trust once cracked doesn't heal, it hardens. And though I still smiled when I saw my son, a part of me had already turned to stone. They say a mother's kindness never runs dry. I used to believe that too, until I realized even kindness has a limit, and mine was reaching its edge. It began with small requests. Ruby would text every week, always polite, always wrapped in words that made it sound like family, not money. "Mom, the kids are starting a STEM class next month. It's only $1,200. You'd want them to have the best." Right, I'd sigh, check my account, and send the money. It felt like doing my duty, like helping my grandchildren learn something good. But the requests never stopped. A few weeks later, another message came. "The roof has a leak. The repair is urgent. $8,000, but we got a good price because it's through my cousin's company." I asked for details, and she sent me an invoice, clean, professional looking, except the company name was her cousin's. Still, I told myself families help each other. I transferred the money again. That pattern continued for nearly 2 years. Each month brought a new reason, a school program, a medical bill, a one-time emergency. I calculated once quietly and realized I had sent nearly $60,000 in total. Yet every time I visited their house, nothing had changed. The roof looked the same, the car was newer, and Ruby wore designer shoes that cost more than my monthly pension. When I finally gathered the courage to say I needed to save for my own future, Ruby's tone turned cold. "If you love your son and your grandkids," she said flatly, "you wouldn't count money like that." There was no warmth in her voice anymore, just a calm kind of cruelty. She made love sound like debt. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the checkbook. The numbers blurred together. I wanted to believe I was helping my family, but what kind of love demanded constant payment? I thought about my husband's old letter, the one that burned in the fire, where he wrote, "Protect what you've built, even from those you love." Now I finally understood what he meant. Something hardened inside me that evening. I didn't cry, not anymore. I just opened my notebook and started writing down every payment, every message, every lie disguised as affection. Because love may forgive, but self-respect remembers. Miles had always been the quiet type, the kind of boy who built things instead of talking about them. As a software engineer, he spent most of his days behind screens, his world filled with codes and deadlines. He wasn't used to conflict, and that made him easy to sway. Ruby knew it. She wrapped her control in softness, concern disguised as love. And before long, she was the one managing everything from their joint account to his calendar. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself it was normal for a wife to handle household finances. But slowly, small signs began to surface. When I called, Ruby would answer, instead of Miles, saying he was too busy. When we did speak, his words sounded different, measured cautious, as if someone were listening in. I noticed how he began repeating phrases that weren't his own. "Mom, Ruby feels like you don't accept her," he'd say gently. Or, "You know how you can be a little controlling sometimes." Those words were never mine, and they were never his either. By the time I realized what was happening, the distance had already grown wide. Ruby had fed him stories about me, how I disapproved of her, how I wanted to control their marriage, how I couldn't let go of my son. Each lie added another layer between us until we no longer spoke from love, but from misunderstanding. I had become the villain in a story she'd written. The turning point came when I stopped sending money. I had to. I was running out of savings, and I needed to think of my own future. A few days later, Miles called. His voice trembled slightly, the same way it used to when he was a boy, confessing to a broken vase. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't want Ruby to feel pressured. She's doing her best. Could you just help a little?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My son, the boy I'd raised, fed, sacrificed for 30 years, was now pleading on behalf of the woman who had drained me. Not out of malice, but out of guilt. Ruby had turned his kindness into her shield. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything I knew, but I didn't. I just listened to his voice, fragile and unfamiliar. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet, staring at the photo of him as a child, grinning, missing a tooth, holding the kite we'd built together. That boy had trusted me completely, but the man he'd become now trusted the wrong person. And the most painful part wasn't losing the money. It was realizing that love, when twisted by guilt, can blind even the best of sons. It was a humid afternoon in June when Ruby sent me the message that broke something inside me for good. The text came with an attachment, a photo of a medical report. "It's my ovarian ultrasound," she wrote. "They found a tumor. I need surgery right away. The estimate is around 5,000. I didn't want to worry Miles, but I don't know what else to do." My hands trembled as I read it. All the air seemed to leave the room. Without thinking twice, I opened my banking app and transferred the money. $5,000 gone in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even call to confirm. All I could think of was my son losing his wife, my grandchildren losing their mother. Fear made me blind, and compassion made me fast. 2 days later, something didn't sit right. The letterhead on the scan looked familiar, so I searched online for the clinic's address. The website was gone. I called the number printed on the document, and a recorded voice said the clinic had permanently closed last year. My heart began to pound. I called another local hospital, pretending to be a patient who wanted to transfer medical records. They confirmed the facility no longer existed. When I confronted Ruby, I expected shame or guilt. What I got instead was performance. She burst into tears, immediately hands shaking, voice trembling just enough to sound real. "It was a mistake, Mom. I must have sent the wrong file. Why would you even think I'd lie about something like this?" Then, without missing a beat, she turned it around. "You think I'm a monster, don't you? You've never accepted me. You don't trust your own family." Her words cut deeper than any insult could. I stood there speechless, feeling something cold spread through me. I wasn't shocked about the money anymore. I was devastated by what it meant. If she could fake illness, if she could invent pain for profit, then nothing was sacred. No line existed that she wouldn't cross. That night I sat in the dark with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. I replayed her tears, her trembling hands, and realized how expertly she wielded emotion as a weapon. I looked at my reflection in the window, tired, older, but awake now. My trust had been the bridge she walked on, and she had just set fire to it. I had reached my limit. After the fake medical report, something inside me hardened. I stopped sending money. For the first time in years, I ignored Ruby's messages. But silence, I learned, can be more dangerous than words. A few days later, her texts started again. First polite, then urgent. "Mom, please, if you don't help this time, the bank will take our car. Just this once, I promise." I stared at the glowing screen and felt nothing but exhaustion. I didn't respond. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I refused to give in. My savings were almost gone, and my faith had run out long before the money did. 3 days passed before she struck back. I opened Facebook one morning and saw her post. "It breaks my heart," it read, "when people grow old and forget kindness, even toward their own grandchildren." There was no name mentioned, but everyone knew. The photo attached was of the twins smiling beside a caption about gratitude and love. The comments poured in like salt on a wound. "You're such a strong mom. Some people never appreciate what they have." By evening, my phone was full of messages from cousins, neighbors, even old friends, asking what had happened, their tone polite but edged with judgment. I didn't answer them either. I sat in my small kitchen, scrolling through every comment, feeling a heat rise in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but something colder. Betrayal wrapped in public humiliation. Ruby had mastered it, the art of cruelty wrapped in virtue. She played the victim perfectly, painting herself as the dutiful daughter-in-law, mistreated by the ungrateful mother. And Miles, trapped between guilt and manipulation, said nothing. The silence of my son hurt more than the lies of his wife. That night, I made tea, opened my notebook, and began saving everything. Screenshots of her posts, copies of her messages, receipts, bank transfers, every transaction that had my name on it. I didn't know why at first, only that I needed to keep proof something real in a world that had turned upside down. As I organized the papers, I realized this was no longer about money. It was about boundaries, what kindness becomes when people mistake it for duty. I looked at the growing stack of evidence and whispered to myself, enough. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Ruby could twist the truth all she wanted, but I had finally stopped twisting myself to fit her version of it. After months of silence, the message came out of nowhere. Mom Ruby wrote the kids, "Miss you so much. This Halloween, let's have a little family night at your place. We'll bring decorations, food, just like old times." The words were warm, even affectionate, and for a moment, I let myself believe them. I could almost hear the laughter of the twins, smell pumpkin pie, feel the glow of family again. After everything, maybe this was her way of making peace. I hesitated, of course. My instinct whispered that it was too sudden, too easy. But the thought of my grandchildren's faces overpowered my caution. I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. I'd love that." Then I spent the next day preparing, bought a bottle of Merlot baked sugar cookies, shaped like ghosts, even picked up 2 small gifts for the twins' little glow-in-the-dark bracelets. I told myself this was how healing began, with small, fragile gestures of trust. When they arrived that evening, the air was crisp and smelled faintly of smoke from nearby bonfires. Ruby swept in first, her hair perfectly curled, her smile bright, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. "Let's make this night special," she said. "We'll clean up the kitchen, light a few candles, and make it cozy, just like the old days." Her voice carried that practiced warmth I once mistook for sincerity. Miles followed, carrying boxes of decorations, and the twins ran straight into my arms. For a while, it felt real. We carved pumpkins, played soft jazz in the background, and laughed more than I expected. My guard began to lower just enough for her to notice. At one point, Ruby suggested we move a few things around the kitchen. "Let's put a candle here by the curtain. It'll look so beautiful in photos," she said. I nodded absently, busy pouring wine. The room smelled of cinnamon and wax, and for the first time in months, I felt almost safe. Later, I stepped out to fetch a tray of cookies from the living room. It couldn't have been more than a few minutes. When I returned, Ruby was standing near the stove, smiling faintly, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in her eyes. The flame by the curtain had grown higher than it should have. I remember reaching for a towel, about to say something. Then the heat hit my face. In that single second, I saw it, the same calm expression she wore the night my house burned, the same tiny smile she thought I wouldn't notice. That night, everything felt almost too calm, too ordinary for what it would become. Ruby was unusually warm. Her voice dipped in honey. "Mom," she said, "why don't you go spend the evening with Mrs. Miller? The kids will be fine. We'll take them trick-or-treating, and I'll keep an eye on the house. You deserve a night off." Her tone was gentle, casual, practiced. I hesitated. The thought of leaving my home even for a few hours made me uneasy. But Ruby smiled, the same reassuring smile that once fooled me into believing she cared. "Go on," she said. "We'll bring the kids back by 9. I'll make sure everything's perfect for when you return." So I did what any trusting mother would do. I put on my gray wool cardigan, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and carried a tin of sugar cookies I'd baked that morning. As I locked the door, I glanced back at the house, my house, and told myself I was being paranoid. It was Halloween, after all. At Mrs. Miller's, the evening passed in laughter and nostalgia. We sat by the window, handing candy to little witches and superheroes who came to the door. For a while, I allowed myself to feel normal again, surrounded by warmth that wasn't tainted by suspicion. Then sometime after 10, the peace shattered. A man's voice yelled from the street, raw, terrified. "Fire. Nora's house is on fire." I froze, the words echoing like thunder in my chest. When I rushed to the window, I saw it, an orange glow climbing into the night sky, smoke curling upward like dark fingers. My knees buckled before I even realized I was screaming. By the time we reached the street, the flames were already devouring the roof. The crowd grew fast, neighbors shouting, someone calling 911, the air thick with smoke and disbelief. My hands shook as I tried to explain that my son's family had been there earlier, that Ruby had promised to lock up after the kids came home. But no one had seen them. Then a voice came from the crowd, an old man who lived 2 houses down. "I saw someone," he said. "A woman in a black hat, leaving through the back door just before the fire spread." He pointed toward the alley, his face pale in the flickering light. "But it wasn't you, Nora. You were already here." In that moment, I felt something break. The heat of the flames didn't hurt as much as the realization settling in my chest. I wasn't looking at an accident. I was watching a plan unfold, one wrapped in the softness of family and the illusion of care. That night, I lost my home. But worse than that, I lost the last shred of doubt about who had lit the match. When the fire trucks finally arrived, the street was already glowing orange like a nightmare frozen in motion. I stood barefoot on the pavement, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, my throat raw from smoke and disbelief. The smell of burnt wood and melted plastic clung to the air, heavy and final. I could barely speak when the officers approached. My mind was still somewhere inside that burning house, among the photo albums, the letters, the years. It took almost 20 minutes before Ruby appeared. She stepped out of a silver SUV, still wearing her Halloween party dress, a black, sequined gown, spotless, untouched by ash. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick unbothered. She rushed forward, dramatically gasping, as if the sight of the fire had just broken her heart. "Oh my God, Mom!" she cried, clutching my shoulders. But her eyes were dry. When the police asked what had happened, Ruby spoke before I could. "It was my fault," she said softly, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "I must have forgotten to blow out one of the scented candles in the kitchen. I never thought this could happen." The officers nodded, taking notes while she kept her gaze fixed on the house, as if rehearsing grief. But the firefighters moved differently. They weren't convinced. One of them, a middle-aged investigator with soot on his helmet, walked toward us carrying a flashlight. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we found traces of a flammable solvent near the floor by the outlet. This doesn't look like a candle accident." The words struck me like cold water. I looked at him, then at Ruby. She blinked once, too slowly. "A solvent," she repeated, feigning confusion. "I don't even know what that means." Her voice was smooth, but her hand tightened slightly on her purse. The investigator scribbled something in his notebook, then turned to me. "Mrs. Harrison, do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you?" For a moment, the world went quiet. The fire crackled in the distance. Sirens faded, and only the sound of Ruby's shallow breathing filled the space between us. I turned my head toward her. She stood beside me, pretending to shiver, arms folded tightly, eyes darting away just long enough to betray her. "No," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "No enemies." Then I paused, watching her closely. But maybe I should start thinking about who benefits from this. For the first time that night, Ruby looked at me, really looked, and for a fleeting second, her expression changed. Something sharp flashed in her eyes, quick as a spark, before she masked it again with a tearful smile. That was the moment the last piece of trust inside me burned away quietly, like the house behind us. 2 days after the fire, I was still sleeping on the stiff motel bed, the smell of smoke lingering on my clothes, when the call came from the insurance company. The woman on the line spoke politely, almost cheerfully. "Mrs. Harrison, we've received your claim for $320,000, she said. I sat up confused. "My claim," I repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Filed under your policy signed by Ruby Wallace Harrison." For a moment, the world went silent. Ruby had attached her name to mine again. I felt the blood drain from my face. "There must be a mistake," I whispered. "I never filed a claim." The representative hesitated, lowering her voice. "According to our records, the form includes your electronic signature. It was submitted a week before the fire." A week before. Not after, before. I drove straight to their office that afternoon. The building smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. When they showed me the document, I saw it, my name written neatly in digital cursive, the kind used for e-signatures. Perfect. Clean. Forged. I stared at it until the letters blurred. I had never touched that form. The timestamp was dated October 23rd. The fire happened on the 31st. The insurance investigator, a man with sharp eyes and a calm tone, leaned closer. "Mrs. Harrison, I shouldn't be telling you this, but it's unusual for a claim to be filed before an incident occurs. We're opening a fraud review." He slid the papers back toward me and added quietly, "You might want to get legal advice." That night, Ruby called as if nothing had happened. Her voice was bright, relaxed, almost cheerful. "Mom, I heard from the insurance company today," she said. "Don't worry, I just helped fill out the forms for you. It's complicated stuff, you know, and I wanted to make sure you'd get paid quickly." I said nothing for a long moment. "You signed my name," I finally said. There was a pause. Then lightly, she laughed. "It's just paperwork, Mom. No big deal. Like buying milk for the kids, you'd do it for us, right?" Her calmness chilled me more than the fire ever had. After she hung up, I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the motel air conditioner. My mind played the timeline over and over, how she'd insisted on handling the documents, how she'd helped me with everything digital. Every act of kindness was starting to look like preparation. For years, I had mistaken manipulation for love. But now, staring at that forged signature, I saw it clearly. The fire wasn't the only thing Ruby had planned. She had built a perfect trap, and I had signed my own name at the bottom. The night after the fire, I sat on the motel bed staring at the small pile of clothes I had salvaged: 3 blouses, a pair of pants, and an old gray sweater. Everything else I owned had turned to ash. The air in the room smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness. My hands still trembled when I picked up the phone to call Miles. I tried to sound calm. "Honey," I said softly, "I don't have anywhere to go. Could I stay with you for a few weeks? Just until I find something." There was a pause long enough for me to hear the hum of silence on the other end. Then I heard Ruby's voice before my son's. She didn't raise it, but the words carried weight. "Mom, you know we only have 3 bedrooms," she said. 5 people already. It's just not practical." Her tone was smooth, polite, final. I didn't argue. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there for a long time, staring at the motel curtains swaying in the weak air conditioning. It was strange how quickly family could become strangers. That night I paid $65 for a bed that smelled of old cigarettes and slept with my purse under the pillow, as if someone might take what little I had left. Each day after I walked to a nearby laundromat, used the free coffee machine in the lobby, and tried to convince myself this was temporary. I had survived worse, I told myself. But something about this, the quiet rejection, the cold efficiency of Ruby's refusal, cut deeper than the fire. Flames had taken my home. She had taken my dignity. 3 days later, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and froze. A message from Ruby. "Mom, could you help us pay the internet bill this month? It's due soon." For a few seconds, I couldn't even process the words. Then I laughed softly at first, then louder, until it sounded almost like a cough. The kind of laugh that doesn't come from humor, but from disbelief. I sat there in that tiny motel room surrounded by plastic furniture and humming lights and laughed because there was nothing else left to do. I had given her everything money trust family, and still she wanted more. Even after the ashes had cooled, she came back for what remained of me. That was when I understood that her greed wasn't about need, it was about control. And I realized something: bitter but true kindness, when given to the wrong person, doesn't soften hearts. It only feeds their hunger. I walked into the police station with the USB heavy in my coat pocket and a quiet that felt like armor. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and paper, and the fluorescent lights hummed in a slow rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I told the desk sergeant I wanted a copy of the incident report, and he lifted his eyebrows as if he had expected me to collapse or to cry. I did neither. I explained calmly that I needed everything on file, all the notes, the timestamps, the statements, because I could not stand in a smoky motel and wait for somebody else to decide whether my life mattered. He led me to a small interview room, and a younger officer with soot under his nails took my statement again, tape recorder clicking faintly. Then he said words that turned the room colder. He said they were not ready to close the case, that there were anomalies in the fire pattern, that the forensics team had detected traces of an accelerant near the outlet, and that their preliminary review of insurance paperwork had raised a red flag. He did not say it bluntly, but I heard the meaning clear as a bell. Insurance fraud. Intentional act. Someone had set a trap and then tried to cash in. As he spoke, I felt the USB burn hot in my pocket like a secret ready to sing. I thought of all the messages I had saved, every invoice sent by cousins and pals of Ruby, the scanned PDF of my own signature that did not feel like mine, the bank confirmations, and the dates and the odd timestamps. I remembered the claim filed days before the fire, the clinical report from a closed clinic, the repeated requests for transfers that always left them with newer shoes and better cars. Each small paper was a thread, and together they made a rope I could use to pull the truth into light. After the interview, the sergeant photocopied the report for me and stamped a date on the top, like a small exclamation. He suggested legal counsel, which felt less like advice and more like a map. I left the station and walked down the main street, past the little bakery that used to bake bread on Saturdays, past the barber that had cut Miles' hair when he was a boy. I kept my head down until I reached the bench where I had once sat with Lydia drinking cheap coffee and swapping stories. Then I took out my phone and called the number I had written down the day I found the USB. Maggie Ellison picked up on the second ring. I had heard about her through a friend from the salon, a woman who had once watched Maggie navigate a messy estate and win restitution for an elderly client. Maggie spoke without rush, asking the exact questions an honest lawyer asks. She wanted dates, copies of documents, names of witnesses, and most importantly, the USB. When I told her about the e-signature and the preemptive claim, I expected the kind of sympathetic murmur that soothes, but what came was steadier, sharper. Maggie said she had handled a case like this, and that insurance companies hated the paperwork that betrayed fraud because paper did not lie unless someone taught it how to. She agreed to take my file and meet me the following day. That evening, back in the thin light of the motel lamp, I opened my diary and ran my pen slowly across the page. The room was quiet, except for the low buzz of the air conditioner. I wrote down the timeline, each transfer, each text, and then I put the USB beside the journal, like an old friend. I rested my hand on the worn leather cover and felt something settle into my bones. I wrote the last line slowly and with a kind of promise that surprised me by how steady it sounded. If justice does not come to me, then I will go find it. I was done being quiet. Grief had burned itself into something sharper, something that finally had purpose. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was a survivor. And survivors, I'd learned, don't wait for justice, they build it. The next morning, I went to see my old friend and former attorney, Carol Myers, a woman I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Her office was small but neat, filled with the scent of coffee and legal paper. When she saw me standing there, disheveled but determined, she simply said, "You've been through hell, haven't you?" I nodded. I placed the USB and a folder of old bank statements on her desk. "Carol," I said, "I need you to look into something for me. The condo Miles and Ruby bought, I helped them pay for it. But I think Ruby forged the paperwork to make it look like a gift." She adjusted her glasses, scanning the first few pages. Her brows furrowed. "This doesn't look like a gift transfer," she said after a moment. "There's no deed of donation here. What I see is a wire transfer labeled as investment contribution. That's very different, Nora." I felt a tremor in my chest, part relief, part anger. "So legally," I asked, "that means I still have a claim?" Carol nodded. "Absolutely. If you never signed any statement declaring it a gift, and the transaction was logged as an investment, that money remains your asset. You could argue for restitution, especially now that we suspect fraud." Fraud. The word felt electric. For months, I'd let Ruby write her own version of the truth, painting me as delusional, bitter, unstable. But the truth had a way of leaving fingerprints, and I was finally holding them. We spent the afternoon combing through files. Every receipt, every signature, every timestamp mattered now. Carol highlighted key dates, cross-referencing them with Ruby's so-called house documents. With every piece of evidence we uncovered, a new thread of her deceit unraveled. "She's clever," Carol said, tapping her pen, "but sloppy. She thought you'd never look. That's her biggest mistake." By the time I left her office, the sky was turning amber, and I could see my reflection in the glass door. Older, yes, but steadier. I wasn't the same woman who had once begged for a place to stay. I walked back to the motel, clutching the folder, each step heavy with resolve. That night, under the dim motel light, I opened my journal again. My handwriting was steadier now. I wrote one line across the page slowly and clearly. I am no longer the gentle mother they could use. I am the survivor, and survivors always find a way to reclaim what was theirs. I met the private investigator at a small diner off Mayfield Road. His name was Dean Keller, a retired fire marshal with eyes that had seen too many lies and too many flames. He didn't talk much, which suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for the truth. He opened a worn leather folder and pushed a few printed pages toward me. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it, the kind that comes when someone knows what they're about to say will hurt. "The insurance policy on your property, there's a new one. It was taken out 3 weeks before the fire." I stared at him, the words catching somewhere between disbelief and rage. By who, I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Ruby Wallace Harrison," he said. "Listed as co-owner and policyholder. Paid the premium in full. Digital signature, same as the one on the claim." The air in the diner thickened. The sound of plates clattering in the kitchen faded into a dull hum. I picked up the papers, my fingers trembling slightly. The date was there in bold print, October 10th, just 21 days before the night that turned my house into a pile of ash. "She filed the policy in your name," Dean continued. "That's why the company didn't flag it sooner. You were listed as primary, but the payment and correspondence went to her email. She knew exactly what she was doing." I pressed my lips together, my mind racing back to every time Ruby had offered to help me with online forms, every password I'd handed over. Because I didn't want to seem difficult every time she'd smiled sweetly while moving closer to what was mine. I had thought manipulation was her worst sin. I hadn't realized it was only her opening act. Dean closed his folder. "Mrs. Harrison, this isn't just about fraud anymore. It's premeditation. You should take this to your lawyer." I nodded slowly. My voice came out steady but cold. "I will." On my way back to the motel, the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but held back like mercy denied. I rolled the window down and let the wind sting my face. It wasn't sadness anymore, it was focus. Ruby had planned every step, and she thought I'd never see it coming. But she was wrong. That night, I spread the documents across the motel desk under the dim yellow lamp. Every line, every signature, every date was a map leading back to her. I took out my notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. "Fire leaves ashes, but it also leaves evidence." Dean called me the next morning. His tone was different this time, calmer, but with the kind of precision that only comes when someone finally holds proof in their hands. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, "I think you'll want to see this yourself." We met again at the diner, the same booth by the window. He brought a small laptop and set it on the table between the coffee cups. "Footage from your neighbor's security camera," he said. "It's from the night of October 31st. He clicked play. The grainy video showed the familiar outline of my front porch. The timestamp in the corner read 9:42 p.m. And there she was, Ruby, wearing the same black sequined dress from the party heels clicking against the pavement purse slung neatly over her arm. She wasn't running. She wasn't panicked. She was calm, composed, looking over her shoulder once before locking the back door behind her. Then she walked away down the alley, her silhouette fading into the dark. Dean paused the video and looked at me. "The fire was first reported at 9:48. That's 6 minutes later." For a long time, I said nothing. The screen's blue glow reflected off the coffee cup, trembling slightly in my hands. My mind replayed every word she had said that night Her insistence that I go visit Mrs. Miller, her promise to take care of everything. Every gesture, every false smile, every drop of sweetness now revealed itself for what it truly was: staging. She knew exactly when to leave, I finally said. My voice sounded strange, distant, almost detached. Dean nodded. There's more. The same camera caught her returning at 10:15 after the fire trucks arrived. She parked a few houses down, took off her jacket, and started crying before anyone saw her. Looks like she wanted to time her performance. Performance. The word sat heavy between us. It was the right one. Ruby's entire life with us had been a carefully written act, scene after scene, each one designed to earn sympathy, trust, and control. And that night, she had directed her grand finale. Dean closed the laptop gently. I'll forward this footage to your lawyer. It's strong evidence, Nora. Between this and the insurance documents, we have a case. I nodded, but my eyes stayed on the frozen image of her walking away. For months, I had felt powerless, stripped of my home, my reputation, my son's trust. But now the truth had a face, a time, a frame. That evening, I returned to the motel and wrote in my journal once more. My handwriting was steadier than ever. She left my house at 9:42. The fire started at 9:48. 6 minutes, that's all it took to turn my life into ashes. But 6 minutes is also all I need to turn the truth against her. For weeks, I lived like a woman rebuilding herself from ashes, patient, methodical, unshakable. Every morning, I spread the documents across the motel desk: text messages, bank transfers, insurance, emails, receipts for fake repairs, and digital signatures that didn't belong to me. Each file was a small scar proof of what I had survived. I labeled everything with care dates, amounts, names, because I knew that when you fight people who lie, details become your armor. I started with the text messages. Ruby's pattern was clear, soft words, guilt, and constant requests. Mom, just this one time. Mom, the kids need help. Mom, you're all we have. Every plea followed the same rhythm: love as bait, debt as the hook. Then came the bank statements. Miles's account had regular deposits, matching the exact sums I had sent. Ruby's name appeared again and again, attached to luxury stores and online transfers. The same woman who told me she barely made ends meet had charged over $2,000 in designer goods the week before my house burned. I printed everything, clipped it neatly into folders, and placed them in a single box labeled simply "For Justice." When I met with Maggie Ellison again, she looked over the files silently. Her expression shifted from interest to disbelief, then to quiet fury. This isn't just manipulation, she said. This is elder financial exploitation. She used your trust, your age, your relationship, all to drain your assets. And Miles. If he knew and did nothing, he's complicit. The word complicit hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about Ruby anymore, it was about my son's silence. The boy I raised to tell the truth had become a man who looked away. Maggie adjusted her glasses and slid a form across the desk. We're filing 2 claims: elder financial exploitation and negligence leading to property loss. You're not just defending yourself, Nora, you're setting a precedent. This could help other women like you. My hands didn't shake as I signed. The sound of the pen on paper felt heavier than any verdict. For months, Ruby had written my story for me, twisting it until I barely recognized myself. Now, with that signature, I took it back. That evening, I returned to the motel, opened my journal, and wrote the date at the top of the page. Today, I wrote, I stopped being her victim. Today, I became her reckoning. The courtroom in Cuyahoga County was overflowing that morning. Reporters jostled for space near the benches. Cameras clicked despite the judge's warnings, and every whisper carried the same phrase: elder financial exploitation under Ohio, revised code 2913.02. To them, it was a headline. To me, it was my life. Ruby entered like a woman auditioning for pity. She wore a long-sleeved black dress, modest and funereal, with her hair pulled back and a pair of glasses she had never needed before. Her lawyer guided her gently to the defendant's table, as though she were fragile. When the judge took his seat, Ruby lowered her eyes, dabbed at imaginary tears, and whispered, "I'm ready." Your Honor, with a tremor that could have fooled anyone who hadn't seen what I had. When the clerk read the charges, financial exploitation of an elderly person, forgery, and insurance fraud, she began to cry softly, shoulders shaking just enough to draw sympathy. Her attorney rose and launched into a carefully rehearsed defense. "My client," he said, voice full of practiced sincerity, "is a devoted wife and mother. She has been misunderstood by a resentful mother-in-law who could not accept her place in the family." Then Ruby spoke, her voice cracking at all the right moments. "I never wanted this," she said, eyes downcast. "I only tried to help. She hated me from the start. I was just trying to be a good daughter-in-law." She paused, glancing toward the jury, her lower lip trembling. "I never took anything from her. I only wanted peace." Her words fell like poison wrapped in silk. The courtroom went still. Even the reporters stopped typing. I could hear the judge's pen tapping softly on the bench. Then I saw Miles. He was sitting beside her, pale, rigid, his hands trembling in his lap. When his eyes met mine, they didn't hold defiance, only guilt. But guilt was too late. Between us stretched a silence that no verdict could bridge, a space measured not in feet, but in betrayal. When the bailiff asked if I wished to testify immediately, I shook my head. "Not yet," I said quietly. The time for my voice would come soon enough. Instead, I watched Ruby. Her tears glistened beneath the courtroom lights, but they didn't move me. I had cried my last tear long before that day. What filled me now wasn't sorrow, it was clarity. I had built my case piece by piece, fact by fact, truth against performance. As she lowered her head again, pretending to wipe her eyes, I realized something profound. I was no longer the victim sitting in the shadows of her lies. I was the mirror she couldn't control, the one that would finally make her see what she really was. Maggie stood calm and precise, her gray suit catching the courtroom light. "Your Honor." She began, her voice steady, but cutting through the air like glass. "The defense wants the jury to believe this was all a tragic misunderstanding. But facts don't lie. People do." She turned toward the technician near the bench. "Please play Exhibit C." The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. A grainy, black-and-white video appeared, footage from the neighbor's security camera. The timestamp read 9:57 p.m. There was no mistaking the figure stepping out of the back door, Ruby dressed in her sequined black gown, purse on her shoulder. She paused, looked behind her once, then walked calmly down the alley. 45 seconds later, a faint orange light flickered through the kitchen window, then grew brighter until the entire frame glowed with fire. The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft hum of the monitor. Maggie let the moment linger before she spoke again. "This," she said, pointing at the screen, "is not negligence. This is intent." Ruby's lawyer tried to object, but Maggie overrode him smoothly. "And now, Exhibit D." She lifted a folder and handed it to the clerk. "This is the supplemental insurance policy purchased by the defendant 3 weeks before the incident, adding a special clause, accidental fire coverage. The policyholder, Ruby Wallace Harrison." The co-signer's name reads Nora Harrison, but the digital signature she clicked the remote, bringing the e-signature onto the screen, was forged. The large projection showed my name in neat looping cursive, copied perfectly, but lacking the subtle tilt I'd used for years. Maggie's voice hardened. "Our forensic technician confirmed that this e-signature was generated from a template, not an original stroke pattern. In plain terms, Your Honor, Someone used software to fake my client's consent. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the judge leaned forward. Maggie turned back to the jury. This is no accident, and it is certainly not the behavior of a misunderstood daughter-in-law. This is insurance fraud and elder exploitation, both felonies under federal law. She let the words hang in the air. The weight of them seemed to press on every person in the room. Ruby's face went pale. Her eyes darted toward Miles, who sat at the defendant's table frozen. His hands gripped the edge of his chair until his knuckles whitened. Then, in a whisper that broke the silence, Miles spoke. "Ruby," he said, voice trembling, "did you—" Ruby didn't answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The performance had ended, and for the first time, the actress forgot her lines. The courtroom air had grown heavy, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The bailiff called the next witness, and an older man stepped forward. Mr. James Miller, my neighbor of 20 years. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at the judge. His voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that carried truth without needing drama. "I saw her," he said, nodding toward Ruby. "I saw Ruby leaving Mrs. Harrison's house that night with a plastic container in her hand. It looked like a fuel can. I was out walking my dog around 9:40. She moved quickly, but not like someone scared, like someone who had already decided what she came to do." A low murmur spread across the courtroom. Ruby's attorney shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The judge motioned to the prosecution. The lead officer took the stand next, holding a folder thick with evidence. During the search of the defendant's vehicle, he said, "We found a gallon of isopropyl alcohol in the trunk, partially used. Forensic testing confirmed it matches the chemical residue identified at the fire's point of origin in Mrs. Harrison's kitchen." The words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Ruby. Her shoulders were stiff, jaw-clenched eyes darting toward the jury. For the first time, her composure cracked. Then Maggie stood holding a stack of papers almost 2 inches thick. She walked to the bench and set them down with a deliberate thud. "Your Honor, these are the compiled messages and emails between the defendant and the victim. Over 60 documented requests for money within the last 2 years. Several under false pretenses of illness, financial emergencies, and fabricated home repairs." She flipped open the binder. The pages glared under the lights. Every message a small betrayal. Every mom. "Please help," another thread in the web Ruby had spun. One by one, Maggie read aloud the most damning excerpts. The courtroom was silent, except for the steady rhythm of her voice. When she finished, the judge leaned forward, his tone grave. "Mrs. Wallace Harrison," he said, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ruby sat frozen for a heartbeat. Then her face twisted, her voice breaking into a desperate cry. "I just wanted her to understand," she shouted. "She never respected me. She acted like I was nothing, like some poor girl lucky to marry her son. She needed to know what it feels like to lose everything." Her words hit the room like a gunshot. The audience gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously, and Miles buried his face in his hands. The judge raised his gavel, but didn't need to strike it. The silence that followed was punishment enough. The silence that followed Ruby's outburst was the kind that could cut through bone. Her words, sharp, venomous, unguarded, hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Every person in the courtroom froze, the echo of her voice still trembling against the wooden panels. For a moment, even the sound of breathing seemed to stop. Then one by one, heads began to turn. First toward Ruby, then toward me. She looked as if she wanted to swallow her own tongue, realizing too late that the mask had fallen. The courtroom that once pitied her now stared with disbelief. The woman who played the victim had just revealed her truth: envy, bitterness, and a hunger for revenge. Miles sat beside her motionless, at first, then lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders shook, not from anger, but from shame. I had seen that gesture before when he was a little boy caught lying about breaking a neighbor's window. Except this time, the lie was bigger, heavier, and it had burned down everything we had. At the back of the room, I heard a soft sob. Little Lucas, their eldest son, sat with a relative clutching a small stuffed bear. The boy's tearful voice broke the silence. "Mommy, why did you say that about Grandma?" The question pierced deeper than any verdict could. Ruby turned toward him, her face crumpling, but he looked away. Even a child could sense the difference between mistake and cruelty. The judge lifted his gavel and struck it firmly against the block. "Order in the court." His voice carried the finality of steel. He looked straight at Ruby, his tone measured but cold. "Mrs. Wallace Harrison, your statement is on record. That single admission confirms motive, resentment, and financial intent. You have provided the court with exactly what it needed." The sound of the gavel echoed through me. Not triumph, not relief, just an ending. I closed my eyes. For a long second, I felt tears slide down my cheeks, slow and heavy. They were not tears of victory. There was no victory here. What I had lost could never be returned in restitution or verdict. My home could be rebuilt. My name could be cleared. But the bond between mother and son that was gone burned to ash long before the fire. When I opened my eyes again, Miles was still bent forward, unable to look at me. Ruby sat rigid beside him, her face pale and empty. And I realized in that frozen courtroom that justice was never about winning. It was about surviving the truth, even when it broke your heart. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned with the verdict. Even the clicking of reporters' pens had stopped. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the creak of wooden benches under the weight of anticipation. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, heart steady. There was nothing left to fear. The judge adjusted his glasses, glanced at the papers before him, and spoke with solemn clarity. After reviewing all evidence testimonies and the defendant's own statements, this court finds the defendant, Ruby Wallace Harrison, guilty of elder financial exploitation, a felony of the 3rd degree, and intentional property damage, a felony of the 2nd degree. A murmur ran through the room. Ruby's face drained of color. She clutched the edge of the table as if it could hold her upright. The judge continued, his tone firm but measured. The court hereby sentences the defendant to 8 years in state custody. She is ordered to make full restitution for insurance fraud and property damages, and she will lose all financial guardianship rights over her minor children. The words landed with a quiet finality. Ruby's lawyer lowered his gaze, already defeated. Then the judge turned toward Miles. "As for Mr. Miles Harrison, the court acknowledges his indirect negligence, but also his cooperation with the investigation. He is granted temporary guardianship of the children under the condition that he completes the Family Accountability Counseling Program and submits regular evaluations to the Department of Child Services." Miles nodded, eyes red, unable to speak. The judge struck his gavel once. "This court is adjourned." The sound echoed like a heartbeat through the room. Reporters rushed out to send their stories. I caught a glimpse of the headlines flashing on their phones. 67-year-old mother wins landmark case against deceptive daughter-in-law. To them, it was a victory. To me, it was simply the end of a very long night. I stood slowly, every movement deliberate, like someone relearning how to breathe. Ruby sat motionless, staring at the floor. Miles didn't look at me, but I could feel the weight of his guilt pressing through the air between us. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, crisp and clean. Reporters called after me, microphones raised, flashes bright. I didn't stop. I didn't pose. Someone shouted, "Mrs. Harrison, how does it feel to win?" I turned my head slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need revenge. I only needed the truth to carry its own name again. And with that, I walked down the courthouse steps, not triumphant, not broken, just free. After the verdict, the world outside the courthouse seemed colder, quieter, as if even the wind refused to carry sympathy for those who had chosen deceit. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't roar. It whispered, written in the clean arithmetic of restitution and law. Ruby Wallace Harrison was ordered to sell the very apartment she had once bragged about, the 3-bedroom condo she had called our symbol of stability. The court's restitution order for elder financial exploitation required her to repay the full $150,000 she took from me, plus 7% annual interest. Numbers on paper, clinical detached, yet each digit carried the weight of betrayal. A week later, I drove past the complex, where she had once posed for Christmas photos with her perfect smile. Now, the building's entrance was littered with wilted leaves, and taped across the door of her unit was a notice printed in bold black ink, foreclosed. Court ordered sale. The words stared back like a verdict carved into stone. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering as movers carried out boxes marked kitchen toys and clothes. I stood at a distance, unrecognized, watching the life Ruby had built on falsehood unravel piece by piece. No one offered her comfort. The same people who had once admired her Instagram-perfect dinners now turned their heads. Deception loses its charm under daylight. When she emerged from the building, escorted by 2 officers, her wrists were locked in handcuffs. The woman who used to arrive in tailored blouses and gold bracelets now wore a gray prison jumpsuit, her face pale stripped of every layer of polish and pride. There was no lipstick, no soft smile, only the raw outline of a person facing herself for the first time. Miles wasn't there. He couldn't bring himself to watch. I didn't blame him. Some reckonings belong only to those who earn them. For a moment, our eyes met. She looked at me not with hatred, but confusion, like someone who finally saw the ruins she had made and didn't recognize them as her own. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. I didn't feel joy. I didn't even feel vindicated. What I felt was a strange stillness, like the air after a storm. I had waited months for justice, and when it came, it arrived not as triumph, but as truth, cold, exact, indifferent. As the police car door shut, I whispered to myself, "Hard work builds. Lies consume. And sometimes the fire you set for others ends up burning your own future first." Ruby's punishment didn't end with the judge's gavel, it only began there. The law had done its part, but society, in its quiet, merciless way, finished the rest. Within a week of the verdict, Summit Tax and Finance, the accounting firm, where Ruby had once boasted of being a trusted financial advisor, issued a brief public statement. It read simply, "Effective immediately. Ms. Ruby Wallace Harrison is terminated for professional misconduct in violation of Ohio Accounting Ethics Code 473518. No sympathy, no excuses, just a cold dismissal printed in black and white." Her colleagues removed her name from the website by noon. By evening, her office email was disabled. The very company she had used to build her image of respectability now erased her like a stain they couldn't risk keeping. A few days later, the Ohio State Board of Accountancy made its announcement. The words were formal, but the meaning was devastating. License revocation, Ruby Wallace Harrison. Suspended from practice for 10 years due to ethical violations related to fraud and elder financial exploitation. The same hands that had once signed tax returns and balance sheets were now banned from touching a single client account for a decade. Then came the news articles. Accountant convicted for exploiting elderly mother-in-law. The story spread fast from local Cleveland papers to national finance blogs, even reaching social media where the comment sections filled with outrage and disgust. Disgrace to the profession. How could anyone do that to their own family? Justice served, finally. It didn't take long before Ruby's name became a warning, not a memory. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with angry emojis before the platform eventually suspended it. Parents in the community where she once lived used her story as a lesson for their children. Integrity isn't optional. In her old neighborhood, the fallout was even crueler. Someone taped a folded newspaper to her former front door, the headline circled in red ink. Accountant jailed for defrauding elderly woman. Underneath, in handwriting sharp as accusation, someone had written, "Let this house remember." When I passed by a week later, the paper was still there, edges curling in the wind. I didn't feel satisfaction, only a kind of solemn peace. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands quietly written in public view for everyone to see. After the sentencing, the courthouse emptied slowly, but Miles didn't leave. He sat on the bench outside, shoulders trembling, hands pressed over his face. For the first time since all this began, he looked small again. Not the man in a suit, not the father of three. Just my son, the boy I used to hold when storms frightened him. I approached quietly, the gravel crunching under my shoes. He didn't look up until his voice broke through his tears. "Mom, I chose to believe the wrong person." The words came out like a confession and a plea all at once. His eyes were red, his voice hoarse. For a long moment, I said nothing. There were too many things I could have said about blindness, pride, betrayal, but none of them mattered anymore. I stood there breathing slowly, then answered with the only truth that felt right. "It's all right," I said softly. "Now you have the chance to do what's right." He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks, and for the first time, there was no wall between us. Just two people who had both lost something and were trying to rebuild from the ashes. A week later, the court granted him temporary guardianship of the children. The state required counseling supervision and regular reports, but they allowed him to stay close, and that was enough. He brought the children to live with me in a small rented house in Cleveland Heights. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a patch of grass that barely passed for a yard, but it was warm, honest, and ours. The first morning they woke up there, the house filled with sounds I hadn't heard in years. The rustle of little feet, giggles, and the clatter of cereal bowls. Lucas climbed onto my lap and whispered, "Grandma, are we safe now?" I brushed his hair back and smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe." Every day, I made breakfast while Miles packed their school bags. In the afternoons, we read stories, cooked simple dinners, and sat together by the small window that overlooked the street. Life had become quieter, stripped of luxury and lies, but somehow more real. Sometimes when the kids were asleep, I caught Miles staring at them with guilt in his eyes. I didn't scold him. He was already carrying the heaviest punishment, knowing that his choices had broken what no sentence could fix: trust. But every night before turning off the light, I'd whisper to myself, families can fall apart, but they can also be rebuilt if love is stronger than pride. They say revenge makes a person bitter. Maybe that's true for some, but for me, it wasn't about bitterness. It was about balance, taking back the piece of fairness that had been stolen from me. Months passed after the trial, and life began to grow roots again quietly, like grass reclaiming the ground after fire. I used part of the restitution money to rent a small storefront on Coventry Road. Nothing fancy, just a bright, sunlit space with 2 mirrors, 3 chairs, and shelves lined with wigs in soft shades of silver auburn and honey brown. I called it Grace and Renewal. It wasn't just a business. It was a way to give women like me, women who had lost something, a reason to look in the mirror and smile again. Every morning, I brewed coffee, swept the floor, and arranged the wigs by hand. Some customers were cancer survivors starting over. Others were older women trying to feel seen again. They would sit down, tell their stories, and leave lighter than when they came in. Their laughter filled the same silence that once haunted me. When the first check from the insurance payout arrived, I didn't keep it all. I donated half to the Elder Financial Protection Fund, a local foundation, helping seniors who had been manipulated or defrauded by their families. The headline once called me the mother who fought back. I wanted that story to mean something beyond my own name. At night, I still wrote in my journal the same one I carried through every motel, every hearing, every lonely night. One evening under the glow of my bedside lamp, I wrote, "Some fires destroy, others reveal what's worth saving." On weekends, the house was no longer quiet. My 3 grandchildren would run through the yard chasing bubbles, laughing in that free, golden way children do. Their laughter reached every corner of my heart, the kind of sound Ruby would never hear again. Sometimes Miles would help me cook, and we didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. Forgiveness isn't spoken, it's lived. The air smelled of cinnamon and peace. As I watched the sunset from the porch one evening, the sky blushed orange over Cleveland Heights. I realized justice doesn't always come in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it comes in the form of ordinary peace, a quiet morning, a healed family, a woman standing on her own again. And if you've ever been exploited or betrayed, don't stay silent. Dignity has no age, and neither does justice.